Alex Wright was a European prodigy born to conquer the American wrestling industry. But the aging kings of the WCW locker room were absolutely terrified of his flawless perfection. To protect their fragile egos, they weaponized humiliation by forcing this lethal fighter into ridiculous, credibility-destroying dance routines. Crushed by backstage xenophobia and veteran jealousy, a generational talent was deliberately ground into dust. This is the dark, untold story of how WCW intentionally ruined Alex Wright to protect a fading empire. The root of his destruction lies in a violent culture clash, the fundamental collision between the authentic European tradition of professional wrestling and the ruthless American corporate machine. Born in 1975 in Nuremberg, Germany, Alex was not a product of a makeshift wrestling school or a bodybuilder looking for a quick payday. He was wrestling royalty. His father, Steve Wright, was a respected, feared competitor who had made his name in the grueling, technically unforgiving British world of sport circuit. This was a world where professional wrestling was treated as a legitimate, punishing sport. The European style, often referred to as catch as catch can, was not about flashy outfits or theatrical interviews. It was about joint manipulation, leverage, pain compliance, and cardiovascular endurance. Steve Wright had grappled with legends, trading holds with men who knew how to legitimately break limbs. This was the curriculum he passed down to his son. From the time he was a young boy, Alex was stretched, twisted, and molded on the canvas. He was taught the architecture of the human body and how to dismantle it. He learned how to move with a fluid, terrifying efficiency. He was not taught how to play to a television camera, nor was he taught the delicate political dance of appeasing fragile egos. He was simply taught how to be flawless in the ring. By the time he was 18 years old, Alex possessed a physical toolkit that took most men decades to acquire. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall, heavily muscled yet incredibly lean, and possessed an aerial agility that defied his height. When scouts from World Championship Wrestling, the Atlanta-based promotion backed by the bottomless pockets of billionaire media, mogul Ted Turner, saw the teenager performing during a tour of Germany in 1994, they did not just see a prospect. They saw a blue-chip investment. They saw a young man who could bridge the gap to the European market, a handsome, explosive athlete who could anchor their television programming for the next 15 years. Alex Wright signed his contract and boarded a plane to the United States. He was 19 years old, barely speaking a word of English, leaving behind his family, his culture, and everything he understood about the world. He was stepping into the neon-lit, high-stakes arena of American television, entirely unaware that he was walking into a geopolitical minefield. The World Championship Wrestling locker room in 1994 was a notoriously toxic environment. It was an oligarchy masquerading as a meritocracy. The company had recently opened its checkbook to sign Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, and a host of other iconic figures from the 1980s. While these men brought immediate television ratings, they also brought an entrenched paranoid culture of self-preservation. Professional wrestling is a unique industry. There is no off-season, and there are no objective statistics like batting averages or touchdowns. Your position on the card, and therefore your income, is entirely dependent on perception. The veterans who controlled the WCW locker room were men in their late 30s and 40s. Their bodies were failing. Their knees were bone on bone from years of taking falls. Their backs were degenerating, and their cardiovascular stamina was waning. They survived on their name recognition, their political influence with management, and their ability to dictate who they wrestled and how those matches were presented. Into this cartel walked Alex Wright. He debuted under the moniker Das Wunderkind, the Wonder Kid. And the moment he stepped through the curtain and executed his first sequence of moves in an American ring, a silent existential panic rippled through the veteran establishment. Alex was too good. That was his first and most fatal crime. When he was placed in the ring with older, slower American talent, the contrast was not just apparent, it was glaring. Alex moved with a crisp, snapping velocity. He executed high-angle suplexes, bridging pins, and springboard aerial attacks with a terrifying ease. He did not look like a rookie learning the ropes. He looked like an apex predator who had accidentally been placed in a petting zoo. For the aging superstars watching on the backstage monitors, a 20-year-old who looked like a movie star and wrestled like a machine was not the future of the company they worked for. He was a direct threat to their mortgages, their television time, and their carefully protected legacies. In the hyper-masculine, deeply insecure world of the wrestling locker room, xenophobia was a readily available weapon. Alex was German. He did not understand the nuanced, unwritten rules of the American Boys Club. He did not know how to politic at the hotel bar, nor did he know how to stroke the egos of the men who held the booking pencils. He simply showed up, worked out, and outperformed everyone else on the roster. This quiet professionalism was quickly misinterpreted or deliberately framed as arrogance. The veterans began to whisper. They suggested to management that the young German was dangerous to work with, a common lie used to sideline talented technicians who made older wrestlers look slow. They argued that the American audience would never truly accept a foreigner as a top-tier hero. They sowed the seeds of doubt in the minds of the executives who had just invested heavily in the teenager. This is the root of the trauma that would define Alex Wright's American journey. He had done absolutely nothing wrong. He had followed his father's teachings, honed his craft to a razor's edge, and delivered exactly what was asked of him. Yet he could feel the temperature in the locker room dropping. He could sense the cold shoulders, the deliberate miscommunications in the ring, the subtle attempts to make him look foolish during live broadcasts. He was a 19-year-old kid in a foreign country, isolated by a language barrier, slowly realizing that his own excellence was the very thing that was making him a target. The executives at WCW found themselves in a peculiar bind. They knew they had a Ferrari in their garage. The crowd reactions to Alex's initial undefeated streak were undeniable. The teenage girls shrieked for him, and the purists respected his mat wrestling. They could not simply fire him, nor could they bury him at the bottom of the card without looking incompetent for signing him in the first place. But they also could not risk upsetting the fragile ecosystem of the locker room, an ecosystem dominated by highly paid veterans who would revolt if a German teenager was suddenly pushed into the main event picture. The system needed a compromise. The veterans needed Alex Wright to be neutralized. They needed to pull his teeth so that he could remain on television, drawing the younger demographic without ever posing a legitimate threat to the World Heavyweight Championship. The solution the booking committee arrived at was a masterclass in psychological warfare and corporate humiliation. If they could not beat him in the ring, they would destroy his credibility before the bell even rang. They would use his youth, his looks, and his European heritage against him. They would weaponize the ridiculous, forcing a highly trained, lethal catch wrestler to step out of the shadows of his father's legacy and into the blinding, humiliating glare of a neon spotlight. The neon lights of the arena entranceway did not illuminate a path to greatness. They exposed a carefully constructed trap. When the booking committee handed Alex Wright the techno-dancing persona in 1995, it was presented to him under the guise of character development. He was told that American audiences needed a hook, something easily digestible, something that capitalized on his youth and physical appeal. He was given a generic pulsing electronic track and instructed to dance his way to the ring, wearing brightly colored jackets and a perpetually plastered smile. To the uninitiated viewer, it seemed harmless enough. But to anyone who understood the ruthless hierarchical mechanics of the professional wrestling industry, it was an act of corporate sabotage. It was a calculated political assassination of his main event potential. In the rigid caste system of World Championship Wrestling, a wrestler's persona dictates their earning ceiling. A silent, brooding heavyweight is a threat. A relentless, technical submission artist is a challenger. But a man who dances his way to the ring, performing an awkward, rhythmic shuffle before a combat sport, is a comedy act. They understood that you can win every match on the card. You can hold secondary championships. But the moment the audience perceives you as a novelty, the glass ceiling seals shut above you. By forcing a highly trained catch wrestler to perform a demeaning club dance on national television, the veteran class successfully neutralized the German prodigy. They stripped him of his inherent danger. He was no longer a gladiator to be feared. He was a jester to be amused by. The mental toll of this cognitive dissonance cannot be overstated. Alex Wright had been forged in the brutal, sweat-soaked gyms of Europe, taught by his father to respect the mat and to treat professional wrestling as a punishing, legitimate athletic endeavor. He possessed an arsenal of suplexes and submission holds that could legitimately incapacitate a grown man. Yet night after night, he was forced to step through the curtain and betray his own pedigree. He had to smile, gyrate, and play the fool. The humiliation was a slow, dripping poison. He was trapped in a paradox. If he refused to dance, he would be labeled uncooperative by management and fired. If he danced, he secured his paycheck and his television time, but he actively participated in the murder of his own credibility. This systemic cruelty was not just theoretical, it manifested physically in the ring. Because he was branded with a comedic gimmick, many of the older American wrestlers felt they had the license to openly disrespect him during live broadcasts. The most glaring, undeniable proof of this veteran conspiracy occurred at the Super Brawl 5 pay-per-view event in February 1995. Alex Wright, still undefeated and rising in popularity despite the dance, was booked in a high-profile match against Paul Roma. Roma was an entrenched veteran, a product of the 1980s wrestling boom who possessed a notoriously inflated ego and a deep-seated resentment for younger talent. He represented the exact demographic of the locker room that viewed Wright as a foreign threat. What happened in that ring was a disgraceful display of professional malpractice. Roma, furious that he was booked to lose to a 20-year-old dancer, actively tried to sabotage the match on live television. When Wright executed his precise high-impact maneuvers, Roma refused to react properly. He no-sold the offense, popping right back up after taking devastating moves, signaling to the audience that Wright's attacks were weak and ineffective. When it was time for Wright to secure the victory, Roma kicked out of the pinning predicament at the absolute last possible fraction of a second, an insider tactic designed to make the winner look weak and lucky rather than dominant. Roma was deliberately trying to expose the business and ruin the young German in front of a global audience. Alex Wright, barely out of his teenage years, found himself in a terrifying position. He was in the middle of a live pay-per-view, standing across from a bitter veteran who was actively trying to destroy his career. A lesser athlete would have panicked or, worse, retaliated physically, which would have resulted in his immediate termination. Instead, Wright relied on the cold, hard discipline instilled in him by his father. He maintained his composure, wrestled through the sabotage, and finished the match with absolute professionalism. Roma was quietly fired by WCW management shortly after the incident, but the damage was done. The message to the rest of the locker room was broadcast loud and clear. The young German was a target, and the veterans could take liberties with him because the system did not truly respect him. As the mid-1990s progressed, the professional wrestling industry underwent a violent, tectonic shift. The cartoonish, brightly colored characters of the past decade were rapidly dying out, replaced by a gritty, cynical realism. The formation of the New World Order, NWO, in 1996 revolutionized WCW television. Suddenly, the most popular figures in the company were anti-heroes, dressed in black, breaking the rules, and acting like legitimate gang members. The audience matured, demanding edgier, darker content. In this new ruthless landscape, Alex Wright's techno-dancing persona became an agonizing anachronism. He looked like a relic from a bygone era, a brightly colored anomaly drowning in a sea of black leather and rebellious attitudes. The isolation he felt must have been suffocating. He was a foreigner thousands of miles from home, performing an outdated, humiliating routine for an audience that was rapidly outgrowing him, all while navigating a locker room that actively wished for his failure. He was making excellent money, holding titles like the Cruiserweight Championship and the World Television Championship, but he was spiritually bankrupt. The championships felt hollow, prop belts handed to a dancing sideshow rather than accolades earned by a premier fighter. He attempted to salvage the persona by turning heel, becoming a villain, leaning into the arrogance of a narcissistic, obnoxious clubgoer. He danced with more exaggerated, arrogant motions, using his undeniable good looks to draw the ire of the male audience. It was a brilliant attempt at adaptation, a desperate maneuver to squeeze blood from a stone. He proved he could manipulate the crowd, drawing genuine, visceral anger from the arenas. He showcased a deep understanding of audience psychology, proving he was not just a great athlete, but a masterful storyteller. Yet the systemic glass ceiling held firm. He was a great villain, but he was still a dancing villain. The older stars, Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, were controlling the main event scene with an iron grip, dominating the championship picture and the television time. They would never allow a man who did a techno shuffle to share the ring with them in a high-stakes scenario. The corporate machine had successfully weaponized his youth and his compliance. They had paid him millions to build his own prison. By the late 1990s, the dancing wunderkind had run its course. The fans were tired of it. The locker room had successfully marginalized it, and Alex Wright was rapidly approaching his mid-20s. He was entering his physical prime, his body hardened by years on the road, his mind sharpened by surviving the political shark tank of Atlanta. He looked in the mirror and realized a terrifying truth. If he did not kill Das Wunderkind, the character was going to take his career to the grave with it. He needed to burn the neon jackets. He needed to silence the techno music. He needed to force the American audience, and more importantly, the entrenched American veterans, to take him seriously. The smiling boy from Nuremberg had to die so that a monster could be born. The death of the dancing kid was not a sudden execution, but a desperate, calculated suicide. By 1999, Alex Wright understood that the brightly colored jackets and the synthetic techno beats were the bars of a very comfortable, highly lucrative prison. He was 24 years old, standing at the absolute precipice of his physical prime, yet he was treated like a nostalgic novelty act in a company that was rapidly spiraling into financial and creative chaos. World Championship Wrestling was losing the Monday Night Wars to its rival, the World Wrestling Federation, largely because the WWF had embraced a dark, visceral, anti-establishment tone. The audience did not want smiling teenagers. They wanted anti-heroes, violence, and grit. Alex recognized this cultural shift. He approached the creative executives with a proposal that was entirely his own, a radical reinvention designed to shatter the comedic perception that the veteran locker room had so carefully built around him. He pitched Berlin. The conceptualization of Berlin was a masterstroke of character reinvention. It was Alex Wright taking the exact xenophobic prejudices that the American locker room had used to marginalize him and weaponizing them into a terrifying on-screen persona. He shaved his flowing blonde hair into a severe, aggressive mohawk. He abandoned the neon trunks for a stark gothic aesthetic. Black leather pants, black gloves, and a long, sweeping black trench coat. But the most brilliant aspect of the character was not visual. It was linguistic. For 5 years, he had tried to assimilate, speaking English to appease the American fans. As Berlin, he refused. He spoke only in harsh clipped German, requiring an arrogant interpreter to translate his disdain for the United States. He was accompanied by a towering, massive enforcer named The Wall. He was a cold, calculating European supremacist who looked upon the American wrestling landscape with utter disgust. This was not just a character change, it was a reclamation of his dignity. Berlin allowed Alex to finally showcase the brutal, catch-as-catch-can technical wrestling his father had taught him without the humiliating caveat of a dance routine. The promotional vignettes began airing on national television, and they were striking. The audience, accustomed to the dancing teenager, was genuinely unsettled by this dark, brooding foreigner. The build-up was working. Management had finally agreed to position him as a serious mid to upper card threat. For a brief, fleeting moment, it appeared that Alex Wright was finally going to break through the architectural barrier that the aging superstars had constructed above him. Then, external tragedy struck with devastating timing. In April 1999, the Columbine High School massacre horrified the nation. The perpetrators had famously worn black trench coats, and a moral panic swept across the American media landscape regarding Gothic aesthetics, industrial music, and violent imagery. Turner Broadcasting, the parent company of WCW, went into an immediate corporate panic. The executives looked at the Berlin character, a brooding, aggressive young man in a black trench coat, and immediately halted his debut. They pulled the vignettes. They kept him off television for months, waiting for the cultural temperature to cool down. This delay was a massive blow to his momentum, a cruel twist of fate that stalled his ascension before it even began. However, a delay is only a hurdle. A talented performer can recover from a delayed debut. What Alex Wright could not recover from was the profound systemic rot waiting for him inside the locker room when he finally was cleared to return. When Berlin finally made his debut, the booking committee laid out a logical, traditional roadmap to establish him as a monster. The plan was for him to appear at the Fall Brawl pay-per-view event in September 1999 and systematically dismantle a popular, established American star. The designated opponent was Marcus Buff Bagwell. Bagwell was the quintessential 1990s American wrestler, highly charismatic, heavily muscled, immensely popular, but notoriously protective of his own political standing. Bagwell represented the exact demographic of the WCW locker room that viewed Alex Wright as an existential threat. Bagwell was a mediocre in-ring technician who relied entirely on his look and crowd connection. If a younger, vastly superior athlete like Berlin came in and convincingly defeated him, it would expose Bagwell's limitations. The unwritten rule of professional wrestling is the concept of doing business. When management decides to build a new star, the established talent must lose gracefully to elevate the newcomer. It is the fundamental economic engine of the industry. But in the chaotic, self-serving environment of WCW in 1999, the inmates were running the asylum. Backstage, hours before the live pay-per-view was set to air to hundreds of thousands of paying customers, Buff Bagwell flatly refused to lose the match. This was a staggering display of insubordination and unprofessionalism. Bagwell argued that losing to a new character would damage his own brand. In reality, he was a drowning man pushing a younger swimmer under the water to keep himself afloat. He knew that WCW was bleeding money, spots on the card were becoming scarce, and he was absolutely terrified of becoming a stepping stone for the German prodigy. The backstage area descended into political chaos. The executives who lacked the backbone to discipline their entrenched American stars caved to Bagwell's demands. Bagwell was pulled from the match entirely, citing a phantom injury or storyline excuse, leaving the highly anticipated debut of Berlin without an opponent. In a frantic last-minute scramble, the booking committee grabbed the first available body they could find to fill the segment. They chose Hacksaw Jim Duggan. If Buff Bagwell was a symptom of WCW's mid-card toxicity, Jim Duggan was a walking museum exhibit of 1980s wrestling paranoia. Duggan's entire career was built on waving an American flag, carrying a 2x4 piece of wood, and shouting USA at the top of his lungs. He was an aging veteran who survived strictly on nostalgia. Throwing a deeply nuanced Gothic German character into the ring with a cartoonish, hyper-patriotic relic was a creative disaster on paper. In execution, it was a televised assassination. When Alex Wright stepped into the ring as Berlin, he was carrying the weight of his entire career on his shoulders. He needed this match to establish his new identity, but Jim Duggan had zero interest in doing business. What unfolded on live pay-per-view was a deliberate, systematic dismantling of his new character. When Berlin applied his crisp, painful European submission holds, Duggan did not grimace in agony. He looked bored. When Berlin struck him with high-impact maneuvers, Duggan no-sold the offense, popping back to his feet almost instantly, shaking his head as if the attacks were the equivalent of a light breeze. Duggan treated the match as a comedic annoyance rather than a violent struggle. By refusing to register pain, Duggan was speaking directly to the audience through his body language, telling them, "This guy is not tough. This guy is a joke. Do not take him seriously." The crowd, taking their cues from the beloved American veteran, went dead silent. The intimidating aura of Berlin evaporated into the arena rafters. By the time the match mercifully ended, the damage was irreversible. Alex Wright had done everything correctly. He had recognized his career was stalling. He had shown the initiative to create a brilliant, era-appropriate character. He had endured the tragic delay caused by the Columbine panic, and he had performed flawlessly in the ring. Yet a bitter veteran with a fraction of his technical ability had single-handedly murdered the Berlin persona in 15 minutes of live television. The emotional devastation of that night in September 1999 is difficult to quantify. For Alex Wright, the realization must have been a crushing, suffocating weight. He finally understood the absolute, unyielding cruelty of the system. It had never been about dancing. It had never been about his ability to connect with the crowd. It was about him. The American wrestling establishment was a closed circuit, a protected syndicate that would rather destroy a multi-million-dollar storyline than allow a 24-year-old foreigner to step over them on the corporate ladder. When he walked back through the curtain after the Duggan match, the silence in the locker room was likely deafening. The veterans had won. They had successfully defended their territory. They had proven that no matter how hard the German prodigy fought, no matter how deeply he reinvented himself, they held the political power to render him entirely impotent. The executives quickly abandoned the Berlin push. The character was immediately downgraded, stripped of its main event presentation, and shoved down into the lower card, where it could safely exist without threatening the men who held the power. This is the true nature of corporate trauma in the entertainment industry. It is not just the denial of opportunity, it is the active, malicious dismantling of hope. Alex Wright was trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare where his own excellence was the primary catalyst for his punishment. The system had looked at a generational talent, a man who possessed the physical tools and the creative mind to carry the company into the next decade, and deliberately chose to break his spirit to appease the fragile egos of men whose best days were a decade behind them. And the most terrifying part was that he still had years left on his contract, trapped on a sinking ship, surrounded by the very men who had just drilled a hole in the hull. The immediate aftermath of the Berlin failure in late 1999 was not characterized by explosive boardroom arguments or dramatic walkouts. Instead, it was marked by a quiet, suffocating corporate erasure. The executives at World Championship Wrestling, completely paralyzed by their inability to manage the rampant egos of their veteran stars, simply swept the character under the rug. They did not reprimand Jim Duggan for his blatant on-air sabotage. They did not address the xenophobic insubordination that had ruined months of planning. They simply looked at Alex Wright, a young man who had just watched his meticulously crafted main event caliber reinvention be murdered on live television, and told him the experiment was over. As the calendar turned to the year 2000, WCW was no longer just losing the ratings war. It was entering a terminal, chaotic freefall. The company was bleeding tens of millions of dollars. In a desperate attempt to stop the hemorrhaging, management brought in Vince Russo, a writer from the rival World Wrestling Federation, known for his frantic, shock value approach to television production. Russo's philosophy was the absolute antithesis of the traditional, athletic European wrestling style that Alex had been trained in. Russo viewed wrestling matches as mere filler between backstage soap opera skits. He prioritized chaos over logic and comedy over athletic competition. For a pure wrestler like Alex Wright, this shift in corporate philosophy was the final nail in the coffin of his serious ambitions. In this new, hyper-cynical environment, the veteran power brokers who had suppressed Alex's rise were still frantically clinging to the lifeboats, protecting their screen time even as the ship sank beneath them. Young talents were treated as entirely disposable. It was in this environment of institutional panic that the booking committee approached Alex with his next assignment. They did not have a new, serious character for him. They did not want to utilize his world-class technical abilities to anchor their crumbling mid-card. Instead, they handed him a mandate that was nothing short of professional humiliation. They told him to put the clown nose back on. Alex was paired with Glenn Gilberti, known on television as Disco Inferno, to form a tag team called the Boogie Knights. Gilberti was a mid-card veteran whose entire career was built on comedic relief. He was a capable performer, but his character was a joke, a man who thought he was John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever. By pairing Alex Wright with Disco Inferno, the system was sending a brutal, undeniable message. They were stripping away the dark, serious aesthetic of Berlin and shoving him right back into the brightly colored dancing caricature they had trapped him in 5 years earlier. The psychological degradation of this specific corporate mandate requires deep analysis. When Alex first danced as Das Wunderkind in 1995, there was a layer of naive compliance to it. He was a teenager eager to please his new American employers. But in the year 2000, the innocence was entirely gone. Alex was now a grown man, a hardened veteran of the backstage political wars. He knew exactly what this gimmick meant. He understood that being part of the Boogie Knights was a public declaration that he was no longer viewed as a competitor. He was purely a sideshow, going from the menacing, gothic intensity of Berlin back to a smiling, dancing fool was a form of corporate gaslighting. The system had crushed his rebellion, and now it demanded his absolute submission on national television. It is here that we see the profound, tragic difference between the European discipline instilled in Alex by his father and the chaotic anarchy of the American locker room. A lesser man, or a more arrogant American star, would have thrown a tantrum. They would have walked out of the building, breached their contract, or refused to perform. Buff Bagwell had done exactly that just months earlier, but Alex Wright possessed a fundamental working-class respect for the wrestling business that his peers completely lacked. He was a professional. He was being paid a significant amount of money to perform a job, and his European pedigree dictated that he perform that job to the absolute best of his ability, no matter how insulting the material was. So Alex went out and danced. He committed to the Boogie Knights with a terrifyingly hollow professionalism. He and Gilberti actually made the act work, drawing reactions from the crowd and eventually winning the WCW World Tag Team Championship. But watching those matches retrospectively is a grim experience. You are watching a world-class catch wrestler, a man capable of anchoring hour-long athletic clinics, contorting himself into a comedic prop to survive in a company that was losing its mind. He executed his flawless suplexes and pristine drop kicks, and then he danced, fulfilling his contractual obligations while his inner ambition was systematically starved to death. This is the hidden trauma of the highly skilled employee trapped in a dysfunctional system. The abuse does not always come in the form of screaming matches or physical altercations. Often, it comes in the form of being forced to actively participate in the diminishment of your own value. Every time Alex Wright shimmied and pointed at the crowd, he was being forced to validate the very veterans who had sabotaged him. He was proving them right. He was just a dancing boy, not a threat to their throne. It is a psychological breaking process known as learned helplessness. The system teaches you that fighting back, like he did with Berlin, results in severe punishment and humiliation. So you eventually accept the degrading role they assign you, simply to survive the workday. While Alex was dutifully playing the jester, the kings who had orchestrated his downfall were destroying their own kingdom. The year 2000 in WCW is widely considered the worst creative and financial period in the history of the wrestling business. The aging superstars, desperate to maintain their relevance, engaged in increasingly absurd and damaging storylines. The World Heavyweight Championship lost all meaning, at one point being awarded to Hollywood actor David Arquette in a desperate, pathetic stunt to garner mainstream media attention. The company was hemorrhaging millions of dollars a month. The fans, disgusted by the lack of logic and the transparent political maneuvering of the aging roster, abandoned the product in droves. The irony was as thick as it was bitter. Their unchecked egos and paranoid gatekeeping drove the audience away, bankrupting the very corporation that was signing their massive paychecks. They had successfully defended the throne room, only to realize the castle was burning to the ground around them. The end arrived with a sudden, unceremonious execution. In March 2001, AOL, Time Warner, the corporate conglomerate that had recently merged with Turner Broadcasting, looked at the balance sheets of World Championship Wrestling and decided to pull the plug. The company that had once dominated the television ratings and forced Vince McMahon to the brink of bankruptcy was sold to the World Wrestling Federation for a fraction of its actual value. It was a humiliating, absolute defeat. When the news broke backstage at the final episode of WCW Monday Nitro in Panama City Beach, Florida, the locker room was plunged into a state of shock. The veterans who had manipulated the system for years suddenly found themselves without a political shield. Their inflated contracts were null and void, and they were now at the mercy of Vince McMahon, a man who had no intention of honoring their backstage demands. For Alex Wright, the collapse of World Championship Wrestling must have triggered a deeply complex emotional response. On a practical level, he was suddenly unemployed. The only company he had ever worked for in the United States, the entity he had dedicated 7 years of his youth to, simply ceased to exist. But on a deeper psychological level, the buyout was an absolute vindication. The system that had marginalized him, the corporate structure that had deemed his European technical brilliance unmarketable while promoting aging, immobile politicians had definitively failed. The market had spoken, and it had violently rejected the philosophy of the WCW veteran class. Alex stood in that locker room on the final night of the company's existence, surrounded by panicked executives and aging stars who suddenly realized their careers were over. He was still only 26 years old. He had survived the xenophobia, the comedic humiliation, the sabotage of Berlin, and the chaotic dying days of the Russo era. He had a pristine physical bill of health, largely because his flawless technique had protected his body from major injuries. As the WWF executives walked through the doors to evaluate the talent they had just purchased, Alex Wright represented exactly what they should have been looking for: youth, experience, international appeal, and world-class athletic ability. The American wrestling landscape was about to be consolidated under one monolithic banner, and the Wunderkind was standing at the absolute perfect age to step into the void and finally claim the respect that had been denied to him for 7 years. But trauma rarely leaves a man eager to jump into another cage, even if the bars are painted a different color. The World Wrestling Federation, under the ruthless, monolithic control of Vince McMahon, did not purchase World Championship Wrestling to integrate its talent. It purchased the company to bury a rival. When the dust settled in the spring of 2001, the WWF assumed control of the contracts, the tape libraries, and the intellectual property. For the majority of the displaced WCW roster, the immediate goal was survival. They scrambled for meetings, begged for tryouts, and willingly subjected themselves to the notoriously brutal, hazing heavy culture of the WWF locker room, desperate to remain on national television. Alex Wright, however, looked at the horizon and made a calculation that defied the conventional, desperate logic of the professional wrestling industry. He was 26 years old. He possessed the prototypical height, muscle mass, and technical proficiency that Vince McMahon historically salivated over. He had a guaranteed contract with AOL Time Warner that he could sit on while he negotiated his next move. The wrestling world expected Das Wunderkind to walk into the WWF and finally become the heavily promoted serious athlete he was always meant to be. But trauma fundamentally alters how a man views an opportunity. To understand why Alex Wright did not sign with the World Wrestling Federation, you must understand the psychological toll of the preceding 7 years. The WWF locker room was not a sanctuary. It was a different, arguably more intense political shark tank. It was fiercely guarded by its own entrenched veterans. Men like Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Undertaker, and Triple H, who were fiercely protective of their spots. If Alex had walked into that environment, he would not have been welcomed as a prodigy. He would have been branded with the stigma of being a WCW guy, a defeated enemy combatant in the Monday Night Wars. He would have had to start from the absolute bottom of the political ladder, subjecting himself to a new regime of hazing, paying dues, and battling a fresh set of paranoid veterans. For a man who had spent his entire adult life being gaslit, marginalized, and forced into humiliating caricatures by the American wrestling machine, the prospect of entering another toxic corporate hierarchy was not an exciting challenge. It was a terrifying repetition of abuse. Alex Wright recognized a profound adult truth that eludes many professional athletes. The spotlight is not worth the total surrender of your dignity. He had watched the veterans in WCW literally destroy their own company, their own industry, and their own legacies simply to protect their fragile egos. He had seen the absolute moral bankruptcy of the American entertainment complex. He had millions of dollars in the bank. He had a pristine physical bill of health, and he had his entire life ahead of him. He allowed his AOL Time Warner contract to expire. He packed his bags, turned his back on the roar of the American arenas, and quietly flew home to Germany. In the hyper-masculine, ego-driven world of professional wrestling, walking away at the absolute peak of your physical prime is often viewed as a failure of ambition. The industry narrative demands that a wrestler must drag their broken body into the ring until they are in their 50s, addicted to painkillers and the validation of the crowd. Alex Wright's departure was not a failure of ambition. It was a triumph of self-preservation. It was the ultimate act of reclaiming his agency. By refusing to play the game in the WWF, he denied the American wrestling system the opportunity to break him a second time. The transition back to a civilian life in Nuremberg must have been a profound psychological decompression. For 7 years, his reality had been dictated by flight schedules, rental cars, screaming fans, and the constant underlying anxiety of locker room politics. He had to shed the skin of Das Wunderkind, the severe intensity of Berlin, and the humiliating absurdity of the Boogie Knights. He had to rediscover who Alex Wright, the man, actually was, independent of a television script. During these quiet years out of the public eye, he worked in the financial sector, a stark, grounded contrast to the chaotic circus of Atlanta. He invested his money wisely. He healed. He separated his self-worth from the roar of an audience. But the blood of a catch wrestler does not simply stop pumping. The European grappling tradition instilled in him by his father was not a corporate gimmick. It was a deeply ingrained respect for the athletic art form. Alex realized that his anger was not directed at professional wrestling itself, but at the corrupt, politically diseased version of it that he had survived in the United States. He still loved the mat, he still respected the holds, the leverage, and the physical chess match of a cleanly executed sequence. In 2007, he channeled his experiences, both the brilliance of his training and the trauma of his American exploitation, into a tangible legacy. He opened a professional wrestling academy in Nuremberg, aptly named The Right Stuff. The creation of this academy represents the ultimate redemptive closure to Alex Wright's story. He did not open a school to build a small empire or to feed his own ego. He opened a school to become the mentor he never had. When young European men and women walk through the doors of his facility, they are not just taught how to execute a flawless bridging German suplex. They are taught the brutal, unvarnished truth about the professional wrestling industry. Alex serves as a living, breathing testament to the dangers of the corporate machine. He prepares his students for the psychological warfare of the locker room. He teaches them to protect their bodies, to manage their finances, and most importantly, to fiercely guard their dignity against promoters who view them as disposable commodities. He built a sanctuary. He created an environment based on the strict meritocratic European principles of athletic excellence, entirely devoid of the toxic xenophobic politics that had derailed his own prime. He took the generational trauma inflicted upon him by the WCW veterans and metabolized it into a protective shield for the next generation of German wrestlers. In doing so, he achieved a level of industry respect and personal peace that completely eluded the paranoid, aging stars who had once conspired to destroy him. When historical observers, wrestling purists, and men of a certain age look back at the chaotic timeline of the 1990s wrestling boom, the name Alex Wright always evokes a specific painful question. What if? What if World Championship Wrestling had possessed the executive backbone to discipline its aging superstars? What if the locker room had embraced a 20-year-old generational talent instead of treating him like an invading threat? What if the Berlin character had been allowed to systematically dismantle the mid-card, establishing a terrifying European antagonist to challenge the established heroes? If he had not been politically suffocated, Alex Wright possessed every single physical and psychological tool required to be a multi-time world heavyweight champion. He could have been the international anchor of the promotion, bridging the gap between the fading stars of the 1980s and the aggressive new millennium. Instead, he serves as the ultimate indictment of corporate mismanagement and unchecked veteran ego. The executives at WCW allowed a clique of aging men to systematically vandalize their most valuable young assets. They prioritized the comfort of the old guard over the survival of the company. In their desperation to hold on to the spotlight, the veterans smothered the exact talents that could have carried the business forward, ultimately ensuring the death of the entire promotion. Alex Wright's story is not a tragedy of a man who lacked the talent to succeed. It is a chilling documentary of a system that functioned exactly as it was designed to, a system engineered to protect the elite by grinding the young, the foreign, and the exceptionally gifted into dust. But the final victory does not belong to the American corporate machine. It belongs to the man who realized the game was rigged, walked away from the table with his mind and body intact, and built a new world on his own terms. Alex Wright did not lose to the wrestling business. He survived it. And in an industry that routinely leaves its performers broken, bankrupt, and discarded, survival is the greatest championship of all.